Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here tonight. For those of you who did come to the panel earlier, where Adam Edlin and I did have an active discussion. Well, Adam had a discussion. The rest of us were active listeners, and I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. My ears got quite a workout. Let me explain how our program is going to work this evening. First, we're going to hear from Carl Bernstein and then from Mark Halperin. They're each going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes. During their remarks, I may mutter under my breath, fake news, loud enough for you all to hear, so you'll know when it is and when it isn't. I will then present questions to both of them, and for the remainder of the program after they make their remarks, we're going to explore the current political climate in the Trump administration and bring some perspective on things for all of you. And at the end of the hour, I promise you, you will leave here with all the answers and all of your dreams will have come true. So, let me start with Carl Bernstein. Few journalists in America's history have left a mark on an era or a profession like Mr. Bernstein. For 40 years, his reporting, books, commentary have revealed the inner workings of government, politics, and the hidden stories of Washington. In the early 1970s, he and Bob Woodward broke the Watergate story for the Washington Post, leading to the resignation of President Nixon and setting the standard for modern investigative reporting. Since then, he has continued to build on that theme, the use and abuse of power, political, media, financial, cultural, and spiritual. He is a renowned prose stylist, having written classic biographies of both Hillary Clinton and Pope John Paul II. He is regularly on Morning Joe. He is a contributing editor of Vanity Fair magazine, and he is also an on-air analyst for CNN, where he has to occasionally appear and fight with hacks like me. Mr. Bernstein, as was mentioned, has been portrayed in the movies. He's been portrayed in 2 movies. All the President's Men by Dustin Hoffman in 1976, and in a movie called Dick by an actor named Bruce McCulloch in 1999. Neither won an Academy Award, but at least one of them should have. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the legend, Carl Bernstein.
Honored to be here with you. I kind of like to set the table a little bit, maybe, for this discussion. And let me start off by picking up on something Bill Lear just said when he mentioned United We Stand. Because it seems to me that we are in the midst, in this country, of a cold civil war. Unlike anything we've experienced in the modern era, and if there is a single thing that all of us, business people, working people, journalists, ought to be able to commit ourselves to, it is to finding some common ground to work our way out of this cold civil war. And it's not just political, it's cultural. It's at all levels of our society. And it's going to require extraordinary work and setting aside of prejudices, of deeply held beliefs, and listening to other people. When I was 16 years old, in my junior year in high school, I went to work almost full-time for a great Washington newspaper. The Washington Star, the town's afternoon newspaper in those days, the conservative newspaper it was regarded in Washington. The Star no longer exists, but it competed against, and in those days usually out-reported, the Washington Post, where later I spent most of my newspaper career. I grew up and was educated in that newsroom at the Star by a wonderful group of people, all of them older than I was, who understood what the press, this calling of reporting and journalism, was about, and knew how to have the time of their lives doing what they loved in a collegial environment that teemed with excitement and drama. In 1960, when I went to work at the newspaper as a copy boy, John Kennedy was running for President of the United States, and I was lucky enough to attend most of his press conferences over the next 3 years, not as a reporter, but to dictate a running text back to the newsroom as Kennedy talked in full, elegant sentences with wit and spontaneity and care for words and learning. And whatever Kennedy's failings, he instilled a sense of common purpose and promise to Americans of all backgrounds and economic means, something we might think about today, getting back to what Bill Lear mentioned. But there's no question that the press, in its coverage of the Kennedy years, failed to use the methodology of investigative reporting and left us with a distressingly incomplete picture of the man and his presidency. Since then, it's been my privilege and good luck to report on each succeeding president of the United States, to write books about them, about a great pope, as was just mentioned, about the history of our time, a biography of Hillary Clinton, who almost became the President of the United States, and for more than 40 years now to travel around this country, especially between the two coasts, to every state, and to learn about the magnificent people who are too often forgotten in Washington, both in our politics and in our journalism. But the greatest lesson that I learned at the Washington Star has been the underpinning of my work since. The idea that two basic notions inform what we journalists ought to do, and which have larger implications, it seems to me, for our country. The first notion is that the press exists for the public good, not just to make money or to entertain or to merely cause controversy. And second, that our primary function as reporters and editors and publishers and news providers, whether today online or in print or TV or video, is to give our readers the best obtainable version of the truth, our readers and viewers the best obtainable version of the truth. Because that's what real reporting, including investigative reporting with its commitment of reportorial time and institutional resources, is. The best obtainable version of the truth. And 57 years after I went into journalism, it's clear to me that something's not working in America today, that our system is straining almost to the breaking point in our journalism, in our politics, and in our larger culture. That notion of the public good, particularly as the underpinning of our politics and our media, has been undermined and overwhelmed in my lifetime by self-interest and careerism, by partisan assertion, by ideological and cultural warfare at the expense of the national interest. So the best obtainable version of the truth has not been our priority enough. Not in journalism, not in public debate in the U.S. Congress, not as consumers and citizens who take up the news and information that we provide and increasingly look for information not in terms of the best obtainable version of the truth, but rather looking for information to reinforce what they already believe, to buttress the ideological, religious, political, and cultural values they already hold, instead of having an openness to different points of view. To have a fact-based debate in this culture today is becoming almost impossible. Now, belatedly, I believe in the Trump presidency, we have seen a renaissance of great reporting. Not fake news, but real news. About the best obtainable version of the truth, which I think is why Donald Trump is so angry at the media and calling us the enemy of the people. It's not with any kind of satisfaction that I think those of us in the media look at this phenomenon, but we have been, in these 6 months of this presidency, by and large, among the great journalistic institutions in this country, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, other institutions, been committed to the best obtainable version of the truth and giving our readers and viewers just that. So our president wasn't talking about us as the enemies of the people when we were reporting relentlessly about Hillary Clinton and her server, about her speeches before Goldman Sachs, about her conflicts of interest as Secretary of State and the Clinton Foundation. In fact, our president was praising us, not as enemies of the people, but as delivering something like the best obtainable version of the truth when it suited those purposes. So what I'm trying to get at here is, and I'm often asked about similarities and differences between now and what happened in Watergate, and they're vastly different, and yet there are, and we can talk about this later, and yet there are some similarities, but the thread that runs through both this presidency and the Nixon presidency is to make the conduct of the press the issue instead of the conduct of the President of the United States. And let me say also, I know of no serious reporter in Washington who does not believe that Donald Trump is the legitimate President of the United States. I know of no news organization that thinks for a moment that Donald Trump is not the legitimate President of the United States. And I think it's apparent to all of us who watched or covered this campaign that Donald Trump had ideas that resonated in this country in a way that his opponents did not. Some of those same themes were sounded by Bernie Sanders. But whatever the case, he recognized things going on in this country that many of us, including the press, were not as cognizant of as we should have been. Our preconceived notions of where a story might go, I've found in 50-something years of reporting, are almost always different than where the story comes out when we've done the reporting. I know of no important story I've worked on in more than half a century that ended up where I thought it would go in the first days that I started on it. And it's important for us as reporters to recognize that people with the information that we want shouldn't be pigeonholed or prejudged by their ideology or their politics. I always remember that all of our sources, virtually all of the important sources in Watergate, were people who had at one time or another been committed to Richard Nixon and his presidency. So I just want to set the table a little bit with those notions, that somehow we have to find a consensus in this country about who we are as a people, what our problems are. We can have great debates, or we ought to be able to have great debates. We started as a country with one of the greatest debates in history, the Federalist debate. People every bit as angry at each other in some ways as we see today. And yet, in the Federalist debate, people were able to come together and recognize real existing conditions in the landscape and agree what that debate ought to be about. We cannot even agree what the debate ought to be about and the basic set of facts today. And the only way that we're going to do that is not to attack the media, but rather to help the media do its job better, and to recognize that certainly in the case of most of the traditional and great news institutions in this country, that we are committed to the best obtainable version of the truth. And we've done a hell of a job in these first months of the Trump administration. Thank you.
right, thank you, Carl. Our next speaker is Mark Halperin, who has covered every American election since 1988. He is, as was mentioned, creator, executive producer, and co-host of Showtime's political documentary series called The Circus, which is actually a fictional show about a reality television star who becomes the president. Oh, this actually happened. Sorry, non-fictional. Halperin is also a senior political analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He appears regularly on Morning Joe and on The Today Show. He was managing editor of Bloomberg Politics and host of MSNBC's With All Due Respect during the 2016 election cycle. He is the most frequently booked guest ever on The Charlie Rose Show on PBS. Prior to joining Bloomberg in 2014, he was editor-at-large and senior political analyst for Time. Before that, ABC News for 20 years. He even covered the O.J. Simpson trial. And just like Halperin, of course, the juice is still in the news today. Mark wrote 2 books, New York Times bestsellers, Game Change about the 2008 election and Double Down about the 2012 election. Game Change was one of HBO's most successful original movies, winning 5 Emmys and 3 Golden Globes. He is working on a 3rd Game Change installment planned for 2018, and HBO is going to turn that into a miniseries. It is tentatively titled Big League Huge Profits Book. It's a tentative title. It may change. Please, ladies and gentlemen, welcome Mark Halperin.
Scott, thank you very much for that nice introduction. You read it just the way I wrote it, which I appreciate. I should say that's not my joke. That's a joke Secretary of State John Kerry tells, so I borrowed it from him. I see some worried faces there. That's my only John Kerry joke. Everything else will come from a better place. Honored to be here with you to talk about what's going on in the country. I should say I understand why they're not here, but Joe and Kelly are both friends of mine, very proud of her and the opportunity she's having. They're generous people. Most generous thing I think they've done for me is they brought me to a game in Kentucky and afterwards let me watch Coach do his press conference, and I determined after that that he'd be a pretty good president, or at least a pretty good White House press secretary. No better pander than that, I know, but it did happen. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context in which Carl and I and our colleagues try to do our job, which obviously is always punctuated by presidential elections as we try to understand the hopes and aspirations of the American people. I've done this not as long as Carl, but covered every election since '88, and this one was hard. It's hard to understand both the contours of the race, but also, again, the larger environment of the country. I've got a friend who's an investment banker in London who says there's only 2 people on the planet who understand how the international economic system works, and unfortunately they disagree. That was a lot what this race was like. In trying to understand things. A month before the presidential election, David Plouffe, who was Barack Obama's campaign manager, told me on television that Hillary Clinton's chances of winning were 100%. That was 100% wrong, and he's one of the smartest people I know. So understanding this race is complicated. Understanding what's going on in America that led to this unprecedented election of this man is complicated. So I'll talk a little bit about that afterwards. We're going to do some Q&A, some with Scott and some with you all. As far as I'm concerned, you can ask whatever you want. Nothing's off limits. You can ask about the details of the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, or what I've learned over the last 25 years, the details of the marriage of Bill and Hillary Clinton, whichever interests you more. My only rule, Carl may disagree, but my only rule during the Q&A is if you could restrict all your questions to the form of true-false. Makes things easier and get a lot more questions in. So my view of what's going on now, and to a large extent what went on in the campaign, as I've thought about it, and again, how this happened and the press's role in it, is there basically have been, since Donald Trump decided he wanted to run for president, two shows. There's, as Scott suggested, there's the Trump reality show, and then there's reality. There's the reality of the real lives of real people around the country. He did not win a majority of the popular vote, but he got a lot more votes than anyone who worked for Hillary Clinton thought he would get. And so one of the puzzles we have to put together in our business every day is there's a lot of appeal for people in the news business and some news consumers for the Trump reality show. It's a really interesting story. It has lots of the elements of fiction. And a big part of that now is all the investigations. That is an OJ-worthy set of cable news hours you can have, talking about who was at what meeting and what's the independent counsel investigating. Why did the president do a long interview with the New York Times where he trashed a member of his own cabinet on the record? All that stuff is interesting and gets a lot of attention. But then there is the reality of America. As I've traveled during the campaign, and then especially after, I've covered politics in all 50 states and went with the president to more than 30 states and talked to people supporting him. I meet two kinds of people generally. Some are liberals who often will say something to me like, this is the worst thing that has ever happened to me, not to the country. And this was before the president had tried to do anything. This was before his agenda was in progress. So there are people in this country who are living what they consider to be through the worst period, 9/11, economic tough times. They think this is the worst period. And then there are people who are really happy about what has happened. I suspect this room has some of both of those kinds of things. And that's a tough thing for people in our business to deal with, because everything I say on television and everything I write is seen through a prism, two prisms that are very different. People who think if you say anything nice about the president or anyone around him, that you're committing a horrible act. And people who think if you say anything negative about the president, you're trying to tear down the newly elected president. Now, I'm not from here, but I've come here a lot. I was here when Rand Paul in this very room announced he was running for president. As I said, I've covered politics in all 50 states. I don't live in Washington, D.C. A lot of people assume that I do because I cover national politics. When I became the political director of ABC News in 1997, I asked my bosses if rather than doing the job from the Washington bureau inside the Beltway, I said I wanted to live near ABC headquarters on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I told them I wanted to be more in touch with the real lives of real people. Amazingly, they bought that. So I get to live in New York, but as I said, I travel quite a bit. And one of the reasons I was one of the journalists who said Donald Trump had a chance to win is because if you go to 30 states with Donald Trump and you talk to his voters and then you go to some Hillary Clinton events, you understand it's not just about the Trump reality show. It's about more than that. It's about a decade long where about 70% of Americans said the country was going in the wrong direction. It's about increasing numbers of Americans over several generations now saying, my kids are not going to have the same or better economic opportunities than I've had. It's about people looking at elites of both parties and their attitudes towards trade and immigration and saying, that's not working for me. It's about 2% growth over 8 years of a presidency with a well-meaning president who never gave people a sense that he had a theory of the case about how we'd have more robust growth than 2%, which is just not good enough. And it's about a feeling that America's role around the world was not quite right, that in some ways we were wasting too much of America's resources and lives in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and at the same time, we're not really confronting some of the more existential threats we faced. And if you travel, and also if you pay attention to election results, you saw over the run-up to the election of Donald Trump, that as a presidential party, the Republicans were in crisis. They had lost the popular vote in 5 of the last 6 elections, and both the Electoral College and the demographics in the country made it seem like Republicans would have a hard time winning the White House. But below that, the Republican Party over the 8 years of Barack Obama was not in crisis at all. Dominating state legislatures, governorships, control of the House and Senate. And so the environment of a lot of people unhappy with the performance in many ways of a Democratic president, was part of the environment. But there's a different part of the environment. Beyond that intense partisanship of Republicans riled up over the Affordable Care Act, riled up over Barack Obama. And that's something that grows out of another thing that Bill Lair said about partisanship and about legislators in state capitals around the country, but especially in Washington, being unwilling to work across the aisle because the loudest and most intense and in many ways powerful voices on our national town square and in state capitals are the extremes. And a lot of legislators are more afraid of losing a primary than they are of losing a general election because of that intensity. You know, during the 8 years Barack Obama was president, I had conservatives come up to me all the time and they'd say a version of this. They'd say, there are 2 things I don't like about the president. Barack Obama's a horrible man. He's a socialist, a communist, he's a Kenyan, he's not a Christian, he's a horrible man. And I'd say, well, what's the other thing you don't like about him? They'd say, he's failed to bring us together as a people. Now, to be fair, I heard liberals say a version of that for the 8 years of George Bush's presidency. We are kind of schizophrenic as a country. Not everybody. There's some people who just want their tribe to win and they want to stomp out the other side. But again, there are people in this room who watch Fox News or watch Rachel Maddow and are intensely partisan, and yet at the same time wonder, why can't we get compromise on things like health care, on immigration, on tax reform? That's the reality. Country wanted change. You can list a lot of reasons. Jim Comey, Vladimir Putin, a failure to have her own message, a lot of reasons Hillary Clinton lost. But in the end, one candidate said, I will roll into Washington with dynamite strapped on my body, blow the place up, and we'll start over. And another one basically said, got a lot of continuity here. I'm an experienced person. The country didn't want continuity. They wanted some pretty fundamental change. That's the reality. The reality show is something different. And again, the reality show is of ceaseless interest to people in our business. I'm not sure it's of much interest to people here in America. I suspect if I drove in any direction from here 40 miles and I asked people on main streets, in barbershops and in diners, what do you think of the president telling the New York Times he didn't like Attorney General Sessions recusing himself from the Russia probe? I don't suspect I'd get much more than blank stares. The reality show is important, and the investigation must be covered by us in a serious way. It's a serious thing. Just based on what the president has acknowledged by his Twitter feed and interviews, he's done some things that need to be investigated. But we cannot treat that as everything, because the reality in the end is more important than the reality show. The president doesn't make it easy for us, because every day he provides reality show content that is irresistible to cable news bookers and headline writers. And again, there are serious aspects of the reality show. But I suspect there are people like Mitch McConnell who wished, and Paul Ryan, who wished that we'd stop having a reality show and just deal with the reality. And I think for the rest of this presidency, and certainly for the remainder of this year, until the Republicans achieve anything, the biggest question is, will the country, including supporters of the president, tire of the reality show enough that they make it clear that they're not interested in that as content that we provide, and they're not interested in that as the way the president conducts himself. I'm going to stop there, in part because I want to make sure we leave enough time for the Q&A, and in part because that is the longest I've talked this year without somebody yelling out, "You lie." Which, for some, even Scott didn't say it. For some reason, that always throws me off. So thank you for inviting us. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Very good. Okay, all right. So we've got about 35 minutes for Q&A. So we're going to have like a little talk show here. If you guys want to use your podiums, that would be great. I'm going to start with Mr. Bernstein and ask you to talk a little bit about something going on in journalism that's getting a huge amount of coverage because the president talks about it all the time, and that is the use of anonymous sources. You, of course, use probably the most famous anonymous source in journalism history. Today, we get a lot of reporting that says sources say. The president says these are made up. So for the crowd, and Mark, you may want to talk about this as well, I think it would be illuminating if you could talk about how do you go about deciding in a newsroom whether to use and run with an anonymous source?
First of all, it's a terrific question. Second, I should note that in more than 200 stories that we wrote during Watergate, we did not have a single named source. They were all anonymous. And that the source named Deep Throat, for the most part, confirmed information that we obtained elsewhere from anonymous sources, most of whom worked in one way or another for Richard Nixon at some point, or many of whom did, some of whom were lawyers, but a situation somewhat like we have today. First of all, think about the culture that we have today and how many people you know in any institution that would be willing to get up and on the record, in the newspaper or on television, say on camera or in quotation marks with their names what they really know and what they really think, and not be worried about their job security, not be worried about opprobrium, not be worried about becoming a sideshow in a public debate. It goes through all institutions today, whether we're talking about banking, whether we're talking about sports organizations, whether we're talking about politics. And in fact, to really get to what's the best obtainable version of the truth, more often than not, I believe, we do have to go to anonymous sources in many, many instances. So that then the burden falls on a news organization to make sure that the reporters using those sources, one, inform their editors who they are, and that the editors exercise a kind of judgment to make sure that these sources don't have an axe to grind, or if they do have an axe to grind, which they might, that their information is put in the context of their axes, or perhaps needs to be confirmed with other sources. But again, I think when you're talking about and here I think is a very big difference between the alt universe and the major news organizations, some of which I named. I think we're quite responsible about the use of anonymous sources, and that it's very easy for the President of the United States or the head of a bank or any institution to get up and attack the sources and say, oh, you're making them up. How many people here, let me ask the question, how many people here believe that a good deal of what you're reading or watching on television today about the President of the United States, based on anonymous sources, how many of you believe that those anonymous sources are making things up or don't exist? There you go. I don't think in the long run it's going to work either. And I think what it does is that constantly going after anonymous sources. And here's the other thing. I was on with Jason Miller on CNN. We don't have that much time. Jason Miller, who had worked in the Bush in the president's campaign, and he was going on and on about these terrible stories based on anonymous sources. And finally, I said, Jason, you spent most of your adult life as an anonymous source. And that's what we're dealing with here, including in... Yeah. Let me ask you the question. Is my characterization correct from you know from the inside about anonymous sources? Am I wrong about this?
I have never been an anonymous source. I've never pitched a reporter as an anonymous source. This never happens in politics, I promise you.
Well, let me tell you who has been one of the biggest anonymous sources of all. Donald Trump. Yeah. Truly, in terms of the self-promotion of his businesses over the years, even to the extent of inventing a character named John Barron that he impersonated and called newspapers under the name of John Barron and said, you can't use my name, but here's what you should know about Donald Trump.
Mark, let me bring you in on this conversation, because what conservatives would say is there has been reporting in the Trump era by many news outlets. In the moment, they say, sources say, for instance, sources say that Jim Comey is going to directly rebut and refute the president when he gives his testimony, and then he turns out not to have exactly done that. In your experience, how do you deal with the use of anonymous sources? What are your thoughts?
So someone the other day said, better we call them confidential sources than anonymous sources. I think that is actually better, because we know who they are. I don't think it's a proper role for us in the press to be at war with the president. I just don't think that's the right posture for us to have. I think it helps him politically, and that's not our role. And I think our job is to, as Carl suggested before, hold powerful interests accountable to the public interest, to try to fix decades-long view of conservatives in the country that were liberally biased, and to be accurate. The story Scott cited was wrong, but it wasn't wrong, I believe, because of some agenda. It was wrong probably because those confidential sources were wrong or purposely misleading. But our responsibility is to every day do things that are in the public interest. And that requires, because of the realities of the way human beings are, to use confidential sources. but not to use them in a biased way, not to use them in an irresponsible way. You have to know who to trust. If the president called me tonight and said, I'm gonna embrace NAFTA, but you can't use my name. You can say senior administration official. And let's say I decided, well, I still need a second source. So I called Reince Priebus, White House Chief of Staff. He said, you can't use my name, but the president's going to come out tomorrow and embrace NAFTA. And I wrote a story, I went on TV and said, 2 senior administration officials say the president's going to embrace NAFTA. And then the president didn't. Did I do something wrong? It's a tough question. But that is, when there's a mistake, it should be of that nature. Not bias, not irresponsibility. So if the White House groundskeeper says tomorrow the president's going to embrace NAFTA, can't use my name, maybe be more skeptical about that. Groundskeeper may not have as much of a window into it. So I think all of this debate over fake news, as in quote unquote, as it relates to the question of confidential or anonymous sources, is a distraction meant to allow the president to talk about that rather than things that he doesn't want to talk about. As long as we're being responsible, not liberally biased or conservatively biased, although that's been less of a problem, and as long as we're trying to think about what's in the public interest, I think it's all just a red herring and a distraction. Every journalist since journalism was invented uses anonymous, confidential sources, and it's a requirement, but it must be done carefully and with judgment, and sometimes it will lead to errors. But we make errors even when we're not dealing with confidential sources. So again, I just think it's a distraction from both the things the president doesn't want us to cover, and it's a distraction from us being held accountable for the things we really should be held accountable for.
Let me add one very quick thing, and what Mark just said, we're going to make mistakes. We do make mistakes. Woodward and I made a bad mistake in the coverage of Watergate. In fact, about a source, and it was a confidential source, and we said that confidential source had testified before the grand jury about controlling a secret fund that paid for the bugging at Watergate and other undercover activities, and we were wrong. He hadn't testified before the grand jury. He indeed was right. We were right about the person who controlled the fund, but mistakes are going to be made. I mean, we're a human institution, but where we go, to expand on something Mark said there, where we go wrong the most, I believe, is context. Context is essential to the best obtainable version of the truth. And that, I think the major news organizations have done really very well in terms of context in this presidency. If you look at the front pages of the newspapers that I've mentioned, if you look at the debates that go on the cable news channels, I think there's an awful lot of context there. That's really a better test of things.
All right, let's talk about an issue. We'll go to you, Mark. Healthcare. Kentucky, of course, has 2 senators. One appears to be trying to help the president, and the other, according to some of the news reporting, has become an object of frustration for the president. Could you talk a little bit?
Can you tell us which one is which?
The senator formerly known as the most interesting man in America.
Yes. So, here's the question. Everybody in here either is or represents people who have employees who provide health insurance for the most part. So, what do you see happening in the next 7 days, 7 to 10 days? How do you see the political positioning of Senator McConnell? What do you think Rand Paul's end game here is on this health care issue? And how is it that Kentucky has become sort of the crossroads of whether this is going to happen or not?
Right. Let me do a quick unscientific survey, ask you to vote by show of hands on health care. If you're uncomfortable voting in front of the others, you can close your eyes as you vote. Raise your hand if you think if the Affordable Care Act, implemented as President Obama and the Democrats envisioned it, raise your hand if you think that would control costs for companies and individuals. Healthcare costs for companies and individuals. Raise your hand. 1, 2, okay, 3, 4. I see 4 hands. Congratulations. By the standards of most business organizations I've spoken to, you're a very diverse group. 4 is a lot. I asked a version of that question for 7 years or so since the Affordable Care Act passed. I could speak to 5,000 people. The president would never get more than a dozen votes. And it's an extraordinary thing because a big part of the reason he passed it, along with feeling the United States should not be the only industrialized democracy didn't have universal health care, was every business in the country, every state and local government would say, healthcare costs are out of control. We can't compete economically until we can get healthcare under control. He did not give people a sense, apparently, based on this room and every other room I've been in, that it would control costs. That's a big issue. Quality of care is a big issue, right? The government programs, the VA, Medicare, and Medicaid, all very big issues. Healthcare, big, complicated issue, huge part of the economy. I think Republicans, we don't have time for me to tell you all the things I think the way Republicans have messed this up. But the main thing is they've not had the courage of their convictions to say, yeah, we think the Affordable Care Act's bad. But here's why ours is better for people. Not just because there's a huge tax cuts mostly for the wealthiest Americans, not just because it cuts Medicare, restrains the rate of growth of Medicare and Medicaid, but because it'll actually in the long run lead to a more market-oriented system, which will in fact control costs for companies and individuals. It never made that case. Never heard Senator McConnell make it. I heard Paul Ryan make it once. Our very policy-oriented, detail-oriented president never made the case as well. So, you know, Senator Paul is fearless. He doesn't care what people say about him. He doesn't care if he's at war with the president. He's a great example of the strangeness of Donald Trump's relationship with Congress. They've played golf together. They've dined together. They have a pretty good rapport, as best I can tell. And yet, as Scott suggested, Senator Paul has been as much a deterrent to getting this passed as anybody. I still think it's possible they'll pass it, something out of the Senate, simply because to not would be to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Every Republican who's run from dog catcher up to president for 7 years has said, I will do this. And the alternative is to have a Republican administration and a Republican Congress implement the law and administer the law until something even worse happens, and that's sort of their current rhetoric, which again I think is not particularly good politics or good policy, to say, well, okay, if nothing passes, we'll just wait for things to get so bad that something must pass. I still believe there's a chance it'll pass. If it doesn't, I don't really understand what happens. I don't understand how the Tom Price, the Secretary of HHS, administers a law he thinks is fundamentally off. But the problem we have as a country on health care is two fundamental things. One is almost every other of our competitors uses single payer. We don't want single payer. Increasing number of Americans do, but it's not going to pass anytime soon. If you don't do single payer, you're going to have a Rube Goldberg complicated system. Maybe less complicated than the Affordable Care Act, maybe less complicated than what we had before the Affordable Care Act, but it's going to be complicated. The House and Senate bills, Republican bills, supposedly market-oriented, are super complicated. And the other problem we have is we won't have a serious talk in this country about end-of-life care and the amount of health care, percentage of health care costs that goes to end-of-life care. Until we have a discussion like that, and until we have a discussion of ways to deal with the entitlement programs, Medicare and Medicaid primarily, that address the solvency of the programs while trying to make sure that Americans get good coverage and good care, we're not going to solve the problem no matter what they pass out of the Senate.
Want to talk about health care?
Only to the extent that common sense would tell me that given where the Republicans are now, that they would invite the Democrats to a conversation. And that conversation would be taking the existing structure of the Affordable Care Act and seeing where they could come up with a way, change the name of the damn thing to some kind of consensus name.
McConnell Care.
McConnell Care. That's it. Change the name of it, and start to work with CMS and other experts at coming up with something that works. The other thing I would say is, in the long run, here we are. Look, everybody here knows what percentage of GDP we spend and continue to spend on health care in this country without having the kind of care that we ought to have, particularly for folks most in need. And in the long run, I don't see how we're going to avoid a single-payer system eventually. And I'm also not as convinced that it's a bad thing. But I think in the interim, I don't understand why right now, if common sense prevailed, the Republicans couldn't say, we're going to surprise you guys. Come, let's sit down and work this out. We'll change the name of this thing. And let's start the way Social Security evolved.
All right, let me ask you another journalism question.
It's not going to happen.
The president has talked a lot about illegal leaks coming out of his administration. Both of you covered administrations. We've talked a little bit about sources, but he calls them illegal leaks. Do you all believe that people should be prosecuted for leaking if they do so in violation of the law, or do you believe people who illegally leak, if that's what they're doing, should be given some kind of protection? And I'll ask you both for a prediction. Do you think anyone during the Trump administration will ever be prosecuted for illegal leaks?
Who do you want to start
Go
with?
ahead.
People who are genuine whistleblowers, who come with information to the press because they think they have seen a great wrong, know that they have, say, a security clearance, know that they do that at risk of being found guilty of breaking the law. But I don't think that's really what we're talking about very much in this instance. And I hate the word leaks. I think most of the stories we're talking about are the result of really relentless reporting by very good reporters going to numerous sources. A lot of the leaks that the president is decrying, you now have more than 40 lawyers involved with the people named in one way or another as having something to do with the Russian investigation. You have people in the White House and in the administration who are talking to reporters. And the notion that most of this story is something done as, but yes, were there some people early on with security clearances who did answer some questions of reporters about what they knew had occurred in the Obama administration with information that they had seen, and they were genuinely concerned that that information was going to be buried by the incoming administration. So I think you have two different sets of information. One, you have a few of those instances, but I think by and large, what we're reading in the papers now, and incidentally, the stories in the past week, very often you'll see stories about the investigation by the FBI or Mueller's office. There's a big one out today. I would make no bets whatsoever that the sources of that come from the FBI or come from Mueller's investigation. I think they can come from lawyers, they can come from the White House, they can come from the Justice Department elsewhere. So I don't want to paint this with too broad a brush, and that would be my answer. But I think, yes, there were a few people early on who might have been concerned that the incoming administration was going to bury what the intelligence community had found. And that information, some of them believed, should not be buried.
The debate over the correct balance between national security and civil liberties is as old as the Republic, and it's an important one, and it's very germane to what's going on now. As a journalist, my orientation is towards the First Amendment and towards saying that if someone feels there's something going wrong and they're in the government and they want to risk prosecution to make sure that information gets into the public, in general, I'm in favor of that, not just because it's good for my business, because I think it's right for the country. There have been some cases of people in the government telling reporters things in this administration that as a citizen I think is probably not good. Some cases. However, the President of the United States, who's so angry about these leaks, got up from his desk in the Oval Office. He could walk out of the door of the Oval and get to the offices of no fewer than a dozen people within 4 minutes who are some of the biggest leakers of information he doesn't like. So he's got to ask himself, why are people close to me, physically near me in the Oval Office, why are they predisposed to do this? And I think he'd be better off spending his time doing that than decrying the widespread practice by which people in the administration and others are revealing things that are going on that relate to his conduct, the conduct of others in the administration, policy, and some of the decisions that are being made.
Let me add one thing about, because the cry that we keep hearing is that national security, that these are leaks about national security. Most national security, quote, leaks come from administrations in power. Every day there are briefings by White House advisors in the national security area in every administration that are conducted on background in which classified information is, quote, leaked, partly because of overclassification, partly to get across the point of view of the administration. So this is, I think it's largely a red herring, and again, it whips up the base. And we haven't talked about the, quote, base, because I think that it's evident that one of the really distressing things about this presidency is that so many actions are intended to energize, whip up, get into a frenzy, the, quote, base, rather than an attempt to unify the people of the United States as you would expect a president to attempt.
Let me ask one more question of you, and then we're going to do a rapid fire yes or no or one-word answer set. But let me ask you a question about polling. The national polls in 2016 actually largely were pretty close to the national popular vote, where things got off the rails were at the state level, especially in the states that Trump shocked the world. What have you heard from your contacts in both parties and in news organizations about how they plan to revamp or revisit their polling methodology for the midterms and for 2020? And do you believe the process of forecasting, which became a phenomenon thanks to Nate Silver, is dead? Because the forecasting was obviously problematic in 2016.
It's really more of a doctoral dissertation than a true-false question. I've not heard much about people making actual serious decisions about how to do things differently. As you know well, national polls are cheaper to do than serious state polls. And there's very little polling, as much coverage as there is as presidential races these days. Go count the number of serious polls with big samples, serious questionnaires, and the right screens of who the likely voters would be. Go count the number that were done in Wisconsin or even Florida. There are just not that many. So people's lust to predict and these forecast models are based on garbage. And so if you've got a model that's based on garbage, guess what? You're going to be somebody who's got this great reputation for understanding politics, who's never met a presidential candidate, who will tell you that Hillary Clinton has a 92% chance of winning, because they don't have any data of their own and they're just looking at garbage, because that's the business they're in, is to pretend that they can predict. So I'm not much into predicting. In a presidential year, you're probably not surprised I get asked 50 times a day who's going to win. And I'm not much into doing it. I'd rather try to understand the issues and what voters are talking about and try to understand the polls. Hillary Clinton was a quasi-incumbent, and even in the states that are people surprised that she lost, like Wisconsin and Michigan, what few real polls there were showed she was below 50. An incumbent below 50 has got a good chance of losing, and she was like the incumbent. So I actually think the polling, even in the battleground states where there was limited stuff, there weren't things that suggested, of course, she was going to win if you understood how to read a poll. I think the problem is those forecast models. Are they dead? No, because the internet means nothing is dead. There'll be people who do it. But I hope serious people who care about the country spend less time saying, oh, Trump can't win because the New York Times says he's got a 7% chance, and try to understand what the aspirations of the American people are and how that might affect what they do when they go to the ballot.
All right, we have about 1 minute, so here comes the lightning round. Yes or no? Will Donald Trump run for re-election in 2020?
Probably. If he's
already violated it.
No, I have to tell you, I don't think yes or no questions like that work.
Okay.
I'm going to pass on it. For many complicated reasons.
But I reserve the right to revise and extend.
Okay. Will someone, anyone, at any level, wind up being convicted or pleading guilty to anything connected with the present investigation environment in Washington?
I'm a reporter. I really think we need to wait and see. It's not a dodge. I believe that's what we ought to do.
Bigly.
Bigly. Will the Democrats take the U.S. House in 2018?
Today, no.
Good possibility.
Carl, you're going to have to adhere to the rules on at least one of these.
Who is the more likely Democratic nominee for president in 2020? Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders?
Neither.
Bernie Sanders.
Sanders. If President Trump chooses not to run for re-election, will Mike Pence be the GOP nominee or someone else?
Someone else.
Someone else.
Will the Congress repeal and replace Obamacare or not?
Nope.
No.
Will the Congress, sometime before the midterm, enact meaningful tax reform or not?
Nope.
No.
Will Ivanka Trump ever be a candidate for public office?
No.
Not a chance.
Will there ever be another on-camera White House press briefing?
Yeah.
Yeah, the first day that Bernie Sanders is president.
All right, last question. If you were building a basketball team, do you want John Calipari or Rick Pitino as the head coach? Okay.
I've already weighed in on that.
We're down to the final two?
Well, there's only two, and everybody else is sort of useless, right? All right, ladies and gentlemen, please thank Mark Halperin and Carl Bernstein.
Thank God.